The Palace of Dresden, 1719. Candlelight flickers along the marble corridors, casting long shadows on the faces of anxious courtiers. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and rosewater, but beneath the perfume something darker lingers, a sense of dread, of fate closing in. In the heart of this labyrinth, a young prince sits alone, his hands trembling as he stares at a small glass vial. The liquid inside is clear, almost innocent, but the prince knows its purpose. Tonight he must choose between duty and despair. This is the story of Friedrich August, heir to the Electorate of Saxony, a prince whose life was shaped not by war or politics, but by a single desperate act. To understand how he came to this moment, we must step back into the world that made him, a world of rigid ceremony, whispered secrets, and the crushing weight of royal expectation. Friedrich August was born into a family that prized appearances above all else. His father, Augustus the Strong, was a man of legendary appetites, famed for his strength, his love affairs, and his relentless pursuit of power. The court he ruled was a place of spectacle, where every gesture was calculated, every smile rehearsed. For a sensitive child like Friedrich, it was a world of constant scrutiny. From his earliest days, he was taught that his body, his mind, even his heart, belonged not to himself, but to Saxony. As a boy, Friedrich was delicate, prone to illness and melancholy. Tutors whispered that he was too gentle for the rough games of the other princes, too thoughtful for the endless parade of courtly entertainments. His mother, Christiane Eberhardine, tried to shield him from the harsher realities of palace life, but even she could not protect him from the expectations that came with his birth. Every day, Friedrich was reminded that he was the future of his dynasty, the vessel through which his father's ambitions would be realized. The pressure only grew as Friedrich reached adolescence. His father, impatient with his son's hesitations, began to arrange a marriage that would secure Saxony's place among the great powers of Europe. The chosen bride was Maria Josepha, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. The match was perfect on paper, uniting two powerful houses, promising peace and prosperity, but for Friedrich, it was a sentence. He had never met Maria Josepha, he knew her only through portraits and the stiff formal letters exchanged by their families. The thought of marrying a stranger, of being bound for life to someone he did not love, filled him with dread. Yet there was no escape. The wedding was set for September, and the entire court buzzed with preparations. Tailors worked through the night, embroidering gold thread into the prince's wedding coat. Musicians rehearsed the processional march. Servants polished the silver until it gleamed like moonlight. As the day approached, Friedrich's anxiety deepened. He began to suffer from headaches, insomnia, and a constant sense of suffocation. His physicians prescribed tonics and rest, but nothing eased his mind. He confided in his confessor, who urged him to accept God's will. He wrote long, anguished letters to his mother, begging her to intervene. But the machinery of state was already in motion, and no one, not even a mother's love, could stop it. On the eve of the wedding, the palace was alive with celebration. Courtiers danced in the great hall, their laughter echoing through the corridors. In his private chamber, Friedrich sat alone, the vial of poison resting on the table before him. It was a simple concoction, prepared by the court apothecary, at the prince's request. Officially, it was meant to calm his nerves. Unofficially, Friedrich knew it could end his suffering forever. He stared at the glass, his mind racing with memories. He thought of his childhood, of the gardens where he had once played in peace. He thought of his father's stern face, of the endless lessons in duty and sacrifice. He thought of Maria Josepha, waiting in her own chamber, as frightened and alone as he was. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, heavier than any crown. Outside, the bells of Dresden began to toll midnight. The sound was soft at first, then grew louder, filling the room with its mournful rhythm. Friedrich closed his eyes and lifted the vial to his lips. The liquid was bitter, burning his throat as he swallowed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a wave of dizziness swept over him, and he collapsed onto the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Servants found him hours later, pale and barely breathing. Panic spread through the palace, as word of the prince's condition reached his father. Physicians rushed to his side, administering emetics and cold compresses. For 2 days, Friedrich hovered between life and death, his fate uncertain. The wedding was postponed, the celebrations replaced by anxious vigils. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, Friedrich dreamed of escape, of running through the forests outside Dresden, of disappearing into the mist. But each time he awoke, he found himself trapped in the same gilded cage, surrounded by worried faces and whispered prayers. The poison had not killed him, but it had changed him forever. When he finally recovered, Friedrich was a different man. The attempt on his own life became a secret shame, spoken of only in hushed tones among the palace staff. His father, furious and humiliated, redoubled his efforts to mold his son into a proper heir. The wedding was rescheduled, and this time there would be no delay. Friedrich met Maria Josepha for the first time on the morning of their wedding. She was younger than he expected, her face pale with fear. They exchanged vows in the cathedral, their voices barely audible above the murmurs of the assembled guests. The ceremony was beautiful, but beneath the surface, both bride and groom trembled with uncertainty. That night, as the city celebrated, Friedrich and Maria Josepha sat together in silence. The weight of their shared fate hung between them, heavier than any words. In the darkness, they reached for each other, not out of love, but out of a desperate need for comfort. For the first time, Friedrich realized that he was not alone in his suffering. Maria Josepha, too, was a prisoner of duty, her life shaped by forces beyond her control. In the weeks that followed, the young couple settled into a fragile routine. They attended court functions, posed for portraits, and performed the rituals expected of them. But behind closed doors, they struggled to find their footing. Friedrich's health remained fragile, his nerves easily unsettled. Maria Josepha, isolated from her family and friends, grew increasingly withdrawn. The court gossiped about the prince's weakness, speculating that he was unfit to rule. Some whispered that the marriage would never produce an heir, that Saxony's future was in jeopardy. Others blamed Maria Josepha, accusing her of failing to inspire her husband's affections. The pressure mounted with each passing day, until the palace itself seemed to groan under the weight of unspoken fears. Yet, in the quiet moments they shared, Friedrich and Maria Josepha began to understand each other. They spoke of their childhoods, of the dreams they had abandoned, of the loneliness that haunted them both. Slowly a bond formed, not of passion but of shared suffering. They became allies in a world that demanded their obedience, finding solace in each other's presence. But the shadow of that fateful night lingered. Friedrich could not forget the taste of the poison, the sensation of slipping away from the world. He wondered if he had truly chosen to live, or if he had simply failed to die. Each time he looked at Maria Josepha, he saw a reflection of his own fear, a reminder that their lives were not their own. As the seasons changed, the court's attention shifted to other matters. Wars raged on distant borders, alliances were forged and broken, and the business of state continued. But in the quiet chambers of the palace, the prince and his bride moved through their days like ghosts, haunted by the choices they had never been allowed to make. And so, the story of Friedrich August, the prince who drank poison to avoid his wedding, became a cautionary tale whispered among the servants, a reminder of the dangers that lurked behind the glittering facade of royalty. For in the end, it was not poison that threatened the future of Saxony, but the slow, suffocating weight of duty, and the silent suffering of those who bore it. The days after the wedding passed in a haze of ritual and routine. The palace, once so alive with anticipation, now felt subdued, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Friedrich August and Maria Josepha were paraded before the court, their every movement observed and analyzed. The prince's recovery from his mysterious illness was attributed to divine intervention, and the official story was that he had simply been overcome by nerves. But among the servants and the inner circle, the truth was known, and it cast a long shadow over the new couple. Friedrich's father, Augustus the Strong, was determined to erase any sign of weakness from his son's reputation. He ordered a series of public appearances, each more elaborate than the last. The prince and his bride attended operas, balls and hunting parties, their faces carefully composed for the benefit of the watching crowds. Behind the scenes, Augustus pressed his son to produce an heir as quickly as possible. The future of the dynasty depended on it, and the pressure was relentless. For Friedrich, these demands were a constant source of anxiety. His health, never robust, began to falter under the strain. He suffered from headaches, stomach pains, and bouts of sleeplessness. The court physicians prescribed a regimen of herbal teas, mineral baths, and long walks in the palace gardens. But nothing could ease the tension that gripped him. Maria Josepha, too, felt the weight of expectation. She was expected to adapt to a foreign court, to learn new customs and languages, and above all, to bear a child. The couple's private life was marked by awkwardness and uncertainty. Their first nights together had been tentative, marked by a gentle shyness rather than passion. Both were inexperienced, and the pressure to conceive only made things more difficult. The court gossiped about their lack of progress, and rumors began to circulate that the marriage was unconsummated. These whispers reached the ears of Augustus, who responded with characteristic force. He summoned his son and daughter-in-law to his private chambers and delivered a stern lecture on their duties to the state. The encounter left both Friedrich and Maria Josepha shaken. They retreated further into themselves, finding comfort only in each other's company. In the quiet of their private apartments, they spoke in low voices, sharing their fears and hopes. Maria Josepha confided that she missed her family, the familiar rhythms of her childhood home. Friedrich admitted that he sometimes wished he could disappear, to live a simple life far from the demands of the court. Despite their struggles, a gentle affection began to grow between them. They found solace in small rituals, walking together in the gardens at dusk, reading poetry by candlelight, or simply sitting in silence, listening to the rain against the windows. These moments of peace were rare, but they sustained them through the long, difficult months that followed. Outside the palace, the world was changing. Saxony was caught between the ambitions of larger powers. Austria, Prussia, and Russia all vied for influence in the region. Augustus the Strong, ever the strategist, sought to secure his legacy through alliances and marriages. Friedrich's union with Maria Josepha was a key part of this plan, and the pressure to produce an heir only intensified as the political situation grew more precarious. The prince's health continued to decline. He became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding public appearances whenever possible. The court physicians grew concerned, and a new regimen of treatments was prescribed: leeches, purgatives, and even the occasional bleeding. These remedies did little to help, and Friedrich's condition became a source of quiet alarm among the palace staff. Maria Josepha, meanwhile, struggled with her own sense of isolation. She wrote long letters to her family in Vienna, describing the loneliness of her new life. She missed the familiar faces of her childhood, the warmth of her mother's embrace. The court in Dresden was grand, but it was also cold, governed by strict protocols and unspoken rules. Maria Josepha found it difficult to make friends, and she often felt like an outsider. Despite these challenges, the couple clung to each other. Their shared suffering created a bond that was deeper than mere affection. They became each other's confidants, the only people in the palace who truly understood what the other was enduring. In the evenings they would sit together by the fire, speaking softly of their dreams for the future. Sometimes, they allowed themselves to imagine a life beyond the palace walls, a small house in the countryside, a garden filled with flowers, days spent in quiet companionship. But such dreams were fleeting. The reality of their situation was never far away. Each morning, they were reminded of their duties: the need to produce an heir, to maintain the dignity of the court, to uphold the reputation of their family. The pressure was unrelenting, and it took a toll on both their bodies and their spirits. As the months passed, the court began to lose patience. Augustus the Strong grew increasingly frustrated with his son's lack of progress. He began to interfere more directly in the couple's lives, sending his own physicians to examine Maria Josepha, questioning the servants about the prince's habits, and even consulting astrologers in a desperate attempt to hasten the arrival of an heir. The atmosphere in the palace grew tense. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, careful to avoid drawing attention. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, speculating about the future of the dynasty. The sense of unease was palpable, and it seemed to seep into every corner of the palace. One evening, as autumn leaves drifted past the windows, Friedrich and Maria Josepha sat together in their private chamber. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Friedrich looked at his wife, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. He spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We must find a way to endure this," he said. "For ourselves, if not for anyone else." Maria Josepha reached for his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. "We will," she replied. "We have each other, that is something at least." In that moment, the weight of their burdens seemed a little lighter. They sat together in silence, drawing strength from their shared resolve. Outside, the world continued its relentless march, but within the walls of their chamber, there was a fragile peace. As winter settled over Dresden, the palace grew quieter. The festivities of the wedding were a distant memory, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of daily life. Friedrich and Maria Josepha continued to navigate the challenges of their new roles, finding comfort in each other's presence. The future remained uncertain, but for now, they had found a way to survive, and so the story of the prince who drank poison to avoid his wedding became not just a tale of despair, but also one of resilience. In the face of overwhelming pressure, Friedrich and Maria Josepha discovered a quiet strength, a determination to endure, to support each other, and to find moments of peace amid the storm. Their story, whispered in the corridors of the palace, became a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring hope that even in the darkest of times, love can offer a measure of solace. Spring returned to Dresden, bringing with it a sense of renewal that barely touched the palace walls. The city outside blossomed with color, but inside, the air remained heavy with expectation. The pressure on Friedrich August and Maria Josepha to produce an heir had not lessened. If anything, it had grown more intense. As months of waiting turned into years, the court's patience was wearing thin, and the couple's every move was watched more closely than ever. Friedrich's health, always fragile, continued to trouble him. He suffered frequent fainting spells and a persistent weakness that no physician could cure. The treatments became more elaborate. Herbal infusions from distant lands, mineral waters brought in barrels from famous spas, and even the advice of traveling mystics who promised miraculous results. Each new remedy was met with hope, but none brought lasting relief. The prince's body seemed to resist every attempt at restoration, as if it too was weary of the burdens placed upon it. Maria Josepha, meanwhile, found herself increasingly isolated. The women of the court, once eager to welcome her, now kept their distance, wary of being associated with a princess who had not fulfilled her most important duty. She spent long hours alone, writing letters to her family and walking the palace gardens in the early morning, when she could be sure of privacy. The loneliness was profound, but she bore it with quiet dignity, determined not to let her sorrow show. Despite the strain, the bond between Friedrich and Maria Josepha deepened. They became each other's refuge, sharing their fears and frustrations in whispered conversations late at night. Sometimes they would laugh together at the absurdity of their situation, finding brief moments of levity amid the gloom. Other times they simply sat in silence, comforted by the presence of someone who understood. The court, however, was not so forgiving. Rumors began to circulate that Friedrich was incapable of fathering a child, that the marriage was a sham, and that Saxony's future was in jeopardy. Some whispered that Maria Josepha was to blame, that she had brought bad luck from Vienna. Others speculated that the prince's mysterious illness was a punishment for some secret sin. The gossip grew more vicious with each passing month, and the couple found themselves increasingly isolated from the world around them. Augustus the Strong, ever the pragmatist, began to consider other options. He consulted with his advisors about the possibility of annulling the marriage, of finding a new bride for his son, or even of bypassing Friedrich altogether in the line of succession. These discussions were kept secret, but the tension they created was palpable. The prince and his wife could sense the shifting currents, the subtle changes in the way they were treated by those around them. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Friedrich and Maria Josepha sat together in their private chamber. The wind howled against the windows, and the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. Friedrich, pale and exhausted, spoke softly. "I sometimes wonder if it would have been better if the poison had worked," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "At least then, all of this would be over." Maria Josepha took his hand, her grip firm. "Don't say that," she whispered. "We have each other. That is more than many can claim." He managed a faint smile, grateful for her strength. In that moment, he realized how much he depended on her, how her quiet resilience had become the anchor that kept him from drifting away entirely. As the storm subsided, a knock came at the door. A servant entered, bowing low, and announced that the elector wished to see his son at once. Friedrich rose, steadying himself against the back of a chair, and made his way through the dimly lit corridors to his father's study. Augustus was waiting, his expression stern. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "You must understand, Friedrich, that the future of Saxony depends on you," he said. "If you cannot fulfill your duties, I will have no choice but to take drastic measures." Friedrich nodded, too weary to argue. He knew that his father's patience was at an end, and that his own position was more precarious than ever. Returning to his chambers, he found Maria Josepha waiting for him. He told her of his father's ultimatum, and together they sat in silence, the weight of their predicament pressing down on them. They knew that their time together might soon come to an end, that forces beyond their control were shaping their fate. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the palace grew even more tense. Servants whispered in the corridors, and courtiers watched the prince and his wife with barely concealed curiosity. The sense of impending change was everywhere, and Friedrich felt as if he were living in a dream from which he could not wake. Yet, amid the uncertainty, there were moments of unexpected grace. One morning, As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Maria Josefa found Friedrich in the garden, gazing at the newly opened flowers. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, the years of worry and disappointment seemed to fall away. "Look," he said, pointing to a cluster of white blossoms. "They survived the winter." She smiled, understanding the unspoken meaning. They too had survived against the odds, against the expectations of the world. For a brief moment, hope flickered between them, fragile but real. But the world outside their private sanctuary was not so forgiving. Augustus the Strong pressed forward with his plans, determined to secure the future of his dynasty at any cost. He began to make arrangements for a possible annulment, consulting with church officials and legal experts. The news, when it finally reached Friedrich and Maria Josefa, was devastating. They faced the prospect of being separated, of losing the only source of comfort they had found in the midst of their ordeal. The thought of starting over, of being forced into new marriages with strangers, was almost unbearable. Yet, even in the face of this new threat, they clung to each other, determined to face whatever came together. As the days grew longer and the palace prepared for another round of negotiations and ceremonies, Friedrich and Maria Josefa found themselves at a crossroads. Their future was uncertain, their fate in the hands of others, but in the quiet moments they shared, they discovered a strength that neither had known they possessed. The story of the prince who drank poison to avoid his wedding had become something more, a story of endurance, of quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to control their lives. In the end, it was not the poison that defined Friedrich August, but the courage he found in the face of despair, and the love that sustained him through the darkest of days. Summer arrived in Dresden, and with it, a sense of finality settled over the palace. The gardens bloomed in riotous color, but inside, the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. The rumors of annulment had reached every corner of the court, and even the servants moved with a new wariness, as if afraid that any misstep might draw unwanted attention. For Friedrich August and Maria Josefa, each day felt like a reprieve granted by fate, a borrowed moment before the world they knew would change forever. Augustus the Strong, relentless in his pursuit of a solution, summoned church officials from Vienna and Rome. The question of annulment was debated in secret meetings, with arguments about duty, lineage, and the will of God. The prince and his wife were kept informed only through whispers and the anxious faces of their attendants. The uncertainty was almost worse than the threat itself, and both Friedrich and Maria Josefa found themselves drifting through the days in a state of quiet resignation. Yet, in the midst of this turmoil, something unexpected happened. Maria Josefa fell ill, at first with a mild fever, then with symptoms that puzzled even the most experienced physicians. The court braced for tragedy, fearing that the princess's frail health would finally give way. But as the days passed, it became clear that her illness was not a sign of decline, but of hope. Against all expectations, Maria Josefa was with child. The news spread through the palace like wildfire. The mood shifted overnight from despair to cautious optimism. Augustus the Strong, who had been preparing for the worst, now saw a chance to secure his legacy. The court physicians were summoned to attend to Maria Josefa's every need, and the couple was given a measure of privacy and respect that had long been denied them. For Friedrich, the news was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. He watched over his wife with a tenderness that surprised even himself, determined to protect her from the pressures that had weighed so heavily on them both. Maria Josefa, for her part, faced the coming months with a quiet courage, aware that the future of Saxony now rested on her shoulders. The pregnancy was difficult, Maria Josefa's health remained fragile, and there were many nights when Friedrich sat by her bedside, listening to her labored breathing and praying for her safety. The court held its breath, and every small sign of progress was greeted with celebration. The couple's bond, forged in adversity, grew stronger as they faced this new challenge together. At last, after months of uncertainty, the day arrived. The palace was hushed as Maria Josefa went into labor, attended by the best midwives and physicians in the land. Friedrich waited outside the chamber, his hands clasped in silent prayer. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last, until finally the cry of a newborn echoed through the halls. A son was born, frail, but alive. The court erupted in celebration, and Augustus the Strong declared a week of festivities. For the first time in years, the palace was filled with music and laughter. The prince and his wife, exhausted but overjoyed, held their child and wept with relief. The birth of an heir changed everything. The threat of annulment vanished, and Friedrich and Maria Josefa were finally allowed a measure of peace. The court's attitude shifted, and the couple was treated with newfound respect. The years of suffering and uncertainty faded into memory, replaced by the quiet joys of family life. Friedrich's health, though never robust, improved with the lifting of the court's relentless scrutiny. He spent more time with his wife and son, finding happiness in the simple routines of daily life. Maria Josefa, too, flourished in her new role as mother, her gentle strength guiding her family through the challenges that remained. The story of the prince who drank poison to avoid his wedding became a legend in the palace, a tale of despair transformed by hope, of duty redeemed by love. Servants whispered it to each other on quiet nights, and courtiers repeated it in hushed tones, marveling at the resilience of the human spirit. In the end, Friedrich August's life was not defined by the moment of his greatest weakness, but by the courage he found to endure, and the love that grew from shared suffering. The palace, once a place of shadows and secrets, became a home filled with laughter and light. And as the years passed, the prince and his family found a peace that had once seemed impossible. Outside, the world continued to change. Wars were fought, alliances shifted, and the fate of nations hung in the balance. But within the walls of Dresden's palace, the story of a prince and his bride endured, a quiet testament to the power of compassion, and the hope that even in the darkest of times, a new beginning is always possible.